Hi, welcome back to the Bible, my cats and I. Hey, today we're going to be covering Matthew chapter 23. I've been looking so forward to this. It is such a powerful chapter, and it is a continuation from what we were studying before. These two chapters of controversy, we'll call them, when Jesus goes head to head with the religious leaders of the time. You can see I'm even wearing the same clothes because I wanted you to get that sense of continuity of these two chapters, chapter 22 and chapter 23. So I wanted to tell you, I once heard a sermon that was based on this particular chapter, and it was entitled Jesus and Yo Mama. So the pastor was likening this to, those old yo mama back and forth. Yo mama's so short, she can sit on a dime and dangle her feet. I don't know, whatever. They were offensive jokes, but it was something that went on a few decades back. It was really popular. And so he was likening this back and forth that Jesus had with the Pharisees to a yo mama contest. And I thought it was brilliant, but I got to tell you, there were some people in the congregation that were offended by the whole idea. But that was the point. Jesus gets in their face. He cuts loose and he offends these religious leaders in front of the people. And so he didn't hold anything back. We're going to get into this today. If you haven't read the chapter, like I always say, please press pause. Make sure you read the chapter before we go through this. I can't cover everything. I'm going to try and give you a good feel for what was going down. So do that right now if you haven't already, and let's get into chapter 23 of the Gospel of Matthew. Now, I want to start out by saying that it is more than unfortunate that this chapter has been used as a weapon of attack and judgment and condemnation over entire people group. This passage has been used in a way to condemn the Jewish people as a whole. It has also been used by non-Christian or former Christian people who had a beef with the church, and they have used it to point fingers and attack the church. But to be true to a good reading of this book, I think we have to remember that Matthew had a purpose for writing this, and I don't believe that his purpose was to use these words as a weapon against an entire people group or an institution. Remember, Matthew had a choice of a wide variety of material that he could include in his gospel as events that he thought were important, part of his message about Jesus' life and ministry and what God was doing in the world. And so Matthew chose this for a purpose. Now, who was he writing to? Remember, this is why it's so important to understand the context behind the writing. He was writing to a group of people who were followers of Jesus, who were beginning to develop this new thing called the church. And I think that he wrote it as sort of like a warning, if you will, to those who were beginning the new church. Now, in writing to his followers, he was including this event of Jesus back and forth and attacks on the religious leaders of the time, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the teachers of the law. But to be sure, though, we have to remember that there were good and faithful leaders within the religious institution at the time of Jesus as well. Those people who did love mercy and justice and walked and worked humbly for God and towards God's purposes. And so we want to remember that. But, there are pitfalls that you can fall into. And there were those religious leaders who had fallen in. And this has always happened, right? We're just humans, and they were human too. And it happens today. And it had the potential for happening in this new thing called the church. So that's why I think Matthew included this passage, not to be used as a weapon against a people group, but to be used as a reminder that we need to do self-checks And we need to avoid those pitfalls that the religious leaders, some of the religious leaders, had fallen into at that time. Now, the first thing we notice at the very beginning of this chapter is Jesus' address to the crowd and to his disciples in front of the religious leaders. Okay, he had just had this back and forth with them where they came to him with tricky questions, right? They were trying to catch him up. They were trying to trap him. And he goes back at them with his own tricky question that made them think. And they walked away saying nothing. Well, it said no one could say a word. And from that day on, no one dared to ask him any more questions. And then immediately it says, then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, the teachers of the law, the Pharisees, sit in Moses' seat. Okay, so get this. He's having this back and forth with the leaders. He asks them a question. They can't answer it. And so what does he do? He turns in front of them to the other people, to the crowd, and says, do you see these guys? Okay, that's kind of the sense. Do you see these guys? Go ahead and listen to their knowledge. They know what they're talking about and they can teach you. Do what they say, but don't be like them. Don't do what they do. And so much of what they do is for show. He talks about that. He goes into great detail, pointing out how so much of what these leaders of the religious institution do is just for show. And he's talking to the crowd right in front of them. But then he turns back and aims his words at the religious leaders at the time, and he opens up, letting them have it with his specific accusations and condemnations. And what I want to point out here is that almost all of these accusations have to do with putting other things in the place that God alone should occupy. Okay? So allowing those things to usurp, if you will, the place of God and God's mercy. That's what I want to show you in these next few passages that are called the seven woes. Woe unto you, you Pharisees, you hypocrites. So beginning in verse 13, that's where we're going to start here. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. You shut the kingdom of heaven in men's faces. And he goes on, I'm going to paraphrase here, basically in these first couple of criticisms that we find in verse 13 and then again in verse 15. Jesus is addressing the leaders with his accusations of laying heavy burdens on the people. We can hear these words of caution here being very easily related to today's church, applicable to today's church as well. But here he says you tend to pile on heavy burdens that you yourself aren't even willing to help them hold up, especially onto new converts with such things. Well, I hear it today in a lot of sermons. You need tos. You know what I mean? You need to do this. You need to do that. Okay? Let me give some examples. You need to go to 2 church services a week. You need to make sure that you go to a weekly Bible study. You need to pray a certain prayer. You should use these words. Pray just like this. You should read your Bible every day. You should write in a journal every day. Make sure you do your soap. If any of you know what that is. Okay, never mind. You need, let's see, some of the more traditional churches, you need to make sure that you practice the offices of prayer 3 times a day or whatever that would be. Give 3 different offerings in every Sunday morning service. You need to double your tithe to double your blessings. You show on, so on and so on. You should do this, you should do that. All about the doing, because that's easily measurable, right? So, maybe you can measure that you're right with God if you can measure what you're doing. And at the same time, by the way, you should quit drinking, stop smoking, stop hanging out with those friends that you used to have. give up your vocation or give up your vacation in order to go on mission trips. You should do this. You need to do this if you're a true Christian. I love new converts. New converts have such a zeal for God when they finally understand God's love and grace in their lives. And I would rather have a church filled with new converts and their zeal for God than for people who are stuffy and extremely knowledgeable and, have been in the church for a long, long time. But if those new converts have been taught that life with God means a lot of heavy burdens, then that zeal becomes even more oppressive towards others, because those converts, those new converts with the zeal, want to teach others the same way. And they teach about the heavy burdens and not so much the mercy of God. I think that's exactly what Jesus is talking about here, how he says, you make him twice as much a son of hell as you are. Okay, so he's saying, don't lay down these heavy burdens. You're doing this, and that's not what it's all about. Jesus accuses the religious leaders of laying down a lot of shoulds. You should, you should, you should. But forgetting to lay out God's grace and God's mercy and God's loving, loving invitation for all to come in and be a part of the family. Come to the banquet, right? And I think that Matthew here is reminding his church about these pitfalls. Let's move on to woes number 3 and 4. Now, these are more about exalting, making really important some of the lesser things. So he goes into talk about making an oath, swearing an oath based on things that are lesser. For instance, the gold that's in the temple rather than the temple that makes the gold sacred. Same thing with the altar, or the gift that's on the altar rather than the sacred altar itself, or especially the one who makes the altar sacred. So this here is fodder for a lot of Facebook arguments, right? Man, do I see this a lot. Like someone puts out there some prayer and that this is the formula for how you're supposed to pray for healing, okay? And then you see all the arguments, those who are in agreement and those who are opposed to it. The prayer is important, and it is beautiful, and healing is absolutely miraculous, and all of that is just filled with faith. But we can't forget that it is not ultimately the words of the prayer, the type of the prayer, or the faith that's behind the prayer, that ultimately it is the one. It is the healer that is the main focus. It is the healer who provides the healing that should be exalted, right? Same thing with communion. Oh boy, that's in the news today. Same thing with communion. Is it who gets to come and participate in communion? Or is it all about who it is that is inviting all to come to the table? Right? Okay, so that's what these Pharisees and teachers of the law are being accused of doing, is making the lesser things more important than the greater. And he also goes in with talking about the herbs that he explains. You Pharisees, you bring tithes of herbs from your herb garden, but you forget the things of mercy and justice and walking humbly with God. So he's saying you should have practiced both. Go ahead and tithe from your herb garden if you want to. And by the way, that was not a required tithe. That was something above and beyond. What was required in the Levitical law was tithes of grain and wine and oil. So to be giving from your herb garden was something above and beyond. And they made great pageantry, apparently, over that, forgetting the other more important things of God. So he's saying, don't forget the more important things. Yeah, do that too, That's beautiful, faithful tithing from your garden. But how can that compare to making sure that the poor don't go hungry? How can that compare to seeking justice for those who are oppressed and for walking humbly with God? So we'll move on to woes 5 and 6. This is found in verse 25. Let's start there. So he's talking here about how they are more attentive to their outward appearances. That seems to be more important to them than what's really going on the inside. The main point of these two woes is that we need to do the inner work first of self-critique and realigning our thoughts and our hearts and our motivations with God's, right? And then what we do on the outside will naturally reflect our rightness and our alignment with God. Man, we are really good at putting on appearances, aren't we? Especially on Sunday mornings, right? We not only want to make ourselves look spiritual, but we're concerned about, well, making ourselves look happy or healthy. Somebody comes up to us in church. One of my friends, Pastor Dave Shirey, used to say, people in church are so likely to just say, you say, how are you? And they're just likely to answer, oh, I'm fine. I'm just fine. That's what we do, don't we? I hear his words in my ears right now. I'm fine. And we do that because, heaven forbid that they should know that we are experiencing depression, which is a real thing, by the way, and health issues, because, oh my goodness, God forbid that should show that maybe we aren't right with God if we're feeling depressed or we're not healthy, which is not correct, okay? I just want to make sure that I lay that out. That is, we are all human and we all experience those things, and we can pray about them certainly, but we experience them. And we can be real with each other, but we prefer to put on appearances so that we can seem righteous. And it also goes with the way we act in church, etc., or even out in the community, so that people will think we're righteous. Okay, Jesus lays this out on the line. You need to do a self-check. And he likens up to washing a sacred cup, and also to these glamorous tombs. They used to go through on a regular basis and whitewash them so they looked all really pretty. They would honor the prophets or whatever. But really, you can, it was inside the tomb, right? Or here, the Bible, my cats and I, we can liken it to a litter box very easily. You're not going to go and take those little Clorox wipes to the outside of the litter box and leave it at that, right? Maybe that might look clean on the outside, but we know it's pretty nasty on the inside. So in order to clean a litter box thoroughly, you need to get in there and clean out the inside. And it's amazing, isn't it? How when you clean out the inside, that there's something about the entire atmosphere that changes. Miraculous, isn't it? So this is Jesus' point. Think about the inside. Worry about the inside. Make sure that your heart and your mind are aligned with God, and that you're doing those things that God is requesting that we do. If we put our energies into being what it is that we believe to be in alignment with God, having our hearts and our thoughts in divine alignment, then people will see that. And we needn't put the energies into trying to make sure that our outward appearances project that as well. Then we move on to woe number 7. And we find that in verse 29. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You build tombs for the prophets and decorate the graves of the righteous. And you say, if we had lived in the days of our forefathers, we would not have taken part with them in shedding the blood of the prophets. So you testify against yourselves. Wow, okay, their traditions were to venerate the prophets by decorating these fancy tombs that were dedicated to the prophets. And yet, they would not take any responsibility for how the religious system of Israel had put the prophets to death. They idolized the prophets, and yet they didn't heed their teachings or their warnings. Okay, it would be kind of like saying, well, again, in a similar way, like you build these fancy buildings, but you don't make sure that the poor have something to eat. So Jesus is just laying it all right out there. And then Jesus really cuts loose. And I'm going to read verses 33 through 35. You snakes, you brood of vipers, how will you escape being condemned to hell? Therefore, I am sending you prophets and wise men and teachers. Some of them you will kill and crucify. Others you will flog in your synagogues and pursue from town to town. And so upon you will come all the righteous blood that has been shed on earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, son of Berechiah. By the way, Abel was in Genesis. The story about Abel's blood being spilt was in Genesis, the first book of the Hebrew Scriptures. Zechariah was in the very last book of the book of Scriptures, Hebrew Scriptures. And so he's saying, from A to Z, that's his way, or literally from Abel to Zechariah, but from A to Z, all the way through, you were responsible. The religious system of Israel, that is. Do you see how throughout this chapter, Jesus is questioning and challenging the misguided religious leaders at the time and the things that they were, that they had allowed to become more important than God's self. They were piling on heavy burdens of shoulds instead of stressing God's grace and mercy and open invitation to all. They were making religious practices more important than God. They were making outward appearances more important than the inner work of self-check toward righteousness. And they were putting traditions of the religious system on a higher throne than God or God's work in the world. This chapter is not about the accusations against a people. I really don't think that it should be used as a weapon against Jewish leaders or anyone, nor a weapon against the church. To honor the intent of the original writing of this gospel and this particular passage, it's best to read it as an invitation for self-check, both personally and institutionally. Is there a religious practice or attitude or a tradition that you may be putting into a place of importance that exceeds that of God's mercy and invitation to all? We should be asking ourselves that question every day. Here I go with the shoulds. In the end of this passage, though, I want to move forward to verse 37 and see what Jesus has to say there. In the midst of his absolute exasperation over misguided religious leaders of the time and misguided religious zeal, Jesus speaks out in desperately loving words. He says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem." Let me stop there. That double naming, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem," using the two names makes a difference and makes us realize that he's reaching out in love. If he just said, "Oh, Jerusalem," it would come across more accusatory once again, and he's coming out of all these accusations. But to say the word twice shows his love for Jerusalem and really almost his broken heart over Jerusalem. "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kill the prophets and stone those sent to you. How often I have longed to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings. He likens himself to a mother hen. I got to tell you about hens, because in addition to cats, I also have 6 chickens in my backyard, because it's what you do, right? I have 6 chickens. And I've got a couple of chickens who go broody. Now, if you're not a chicken raiser, you might not be familiar with that term, but basically it means that those chickens are sometimes, on occasion, bound and determined that they are going to have babies, that they are going to make those eggs hatch into babies, and they will be mother hens. Even though we don't have a rooster and those eggs are unfertilized, so it's not going to happen, but they are bound and determined. And I'm telling you, they get feisty. They get downright feisty, these chickens. They get all fluffed up when you try and get into the nesting box, and they sit there all day long. They barely come down for food. They fight for those babies, and they are fierce. And looking at Jesus' example of a mother hen and what a mother hen would do, bringing the brood out, extending her wings and bringing that brood back into herself. Have you ever seen a chicken do that? And she kind of wiggles down around them and holds them. She uses her wings and her body as a protection to save her chicks. I have heard stories about chickens that give their very lives in such a way where they outstretch their wings and bring their chicks into the fold, into them, if you will, and they themselves are killed by the danger, but their chicks are safe because of their sacrifice. Isn't it interesting that Jesus uses this comparison to himself? How I wish that I could draw you under my wings like a hen, he says. And isn't that what he's about to do when Jesus extends his arms on the cross to provide safety, salvation to those within the fold, within the brood, within the group, within the family of God? So much so that he's about to give his life to save those he has brought in. Jesus knows that that's what he's about to do. He will spread his arms wide for the purpose of saving the offspring of God. Will you accept Jesus' supreme act of love for you and on the part of all creation? Will you put that in its place of importance in your life and align your life and your values with the divine? That's what I leave you with today. That, along with many blessings and wishes for peace, grace, and mercy in your life.